Hey guys, have you ever wondered what it truly felt like to be hungry? Not the fleeting hunger before lunch, but the deep, gnawing emptiness that follows you from dawn to dusk, season after season. What did bread taste like when it was your entire world? How did water become a luxury and salt more precious than silver? Tonight we're drifting back 7 centuries, to a time when every morsel carried the weight of survival, when the rhythm of eating was the rhythm of life itself. We'll slip into the worn leather shoes of a medieval peasant and taste their world, grain by precious grain. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's strangely comforting to see how many of us are drifting off together from different corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. The year is 1294. Picture yourself awakening not to an alarm, but to the low lowing of cattle in the distance and the rustle of straw beneath your body. Your bed is not a bed at all. It's a rough mattress stuffed with whatever dried grass and reeds you could gather before the autumn frost. The timber frame of your dwelling creaks softly around you, and through the gaps in the wattle and daub walls, the gray morning mist seeps in like a gentle, unwelcome visitor. You are a villain, not quite free, not entirely bound. Your life exists in that strange middle space. You can marry whom you choose. You can save what coins come your way, but you cannot simply pack up and leave this manor. Your hands belong to the Lord's land before they belong to you. Your days are counted not by ours, but by seasons and harvests and the endless, quiet rhythm of survival. Before the rooster has even thought to crow, you're pushing yourself upright, your joints protesting the cold. The single room you share with your wife and 3 children, if you're fortunate enough to have them all still living, smells of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and the faint sourness of yesterday's ale. The hearth in the center of the room has burned down to cold ash, and you know that lighting it again will consume precious fuel that must last through the long months ahead. Your first meal of the day, if it can be called a meal, waits on the rough wooden table, though table is a generous word for the planks laid across the stumps. There sits a heel of bread from the night before, dark and coarse, made from rye flour that was ground with stones that left their own grit in every bite. The bread is hard now, almost hard enough to crack your teeth if you're not careful. You break it into a wooden bowl, one of only 2 bowls your household possesses, and pour over it a cup of small ale, the weak, cloudy beer that is safer to drink than the water from the stream. The ale has a tang to it, not quite sour, but heading in that direction. It's barely alcoholic, just enough to kill whatever might make you sick. And it tastes of grain and yeast and the faint bitterness of hops, if you're really lucky enough to live where they grow. As the bread softens in the liquid, it becomes something you can actually chew and swallow. A porridge of sorts that fills your belly with something warm and substantial, at least for a little while. You step outside, and the morning air hits your face like a gentle slap. It's almost always damp in this part of northern France, where the mist rolls in from the fields and settles into your bones. Your breath clouds before you, and you pull your rough wool tunic closer around your shoulders. The fabric is thick and scratchy, woven by your wife from wool you managed to trade for after shearing your one sheep. It smells of lanolin and smoke and human sweat, because washing it too often would make it fall apart, and replacing it is a luxury you can't afford. The field stretches before you, brown and stubbled from the recent harvest, or green and tender if it's spring, or golden and heavy if it's summer. Whatever the season, the field is waiting. It's always waiting. The rhythm of your days is dictated not by clocks. What use would you have for such a thing? But by the sun and the seasons and the endless needs of the earth. It's spring, you're walking behind the ox you share with 3 other families. It's guiding the wooden plow that scratches furrows in the hard ground. The ox moves slowly, patiently, its breath steaming in the cool air, and you follow, your feet sinking into the cold mud, feeling the resistance of the soil against the iron-tipped plow. Your hands wrapped around the wooden handle grow numb, and then warm, and then raw as the morning stretches into midday. If it's summer, you're bent over with a sickle, cutting grain stalk by stalk, the sun beating down on your back until your tunic sticks to your skin with sweat. The grain whispers as you cut it, a soft, dry sound that becomes the soundtrack to your life. Your back aches, your shoulders burn, But you continue, because this grain, this precious grain, is what stands between your family and hunger in the months to come. If it's autumn, you're threshing, beating the grain from the stalks with a wooden flail. The rhythmic thok-thok echoing across the barn as you and the other villagers work together. The chaff floats in the air like golden dust, making you cough and sneeze, but you don't stop. You can't stop. Every grain that doesn't make it into the sacks is a meal that woe and grace your table when the snow flies. And if it's winter, you're huddled in your cottage, mending tools with numb fingers. Rationing the grain you've stored, praying it will last until spring returns. The days are short and gray, and the cold seeps through every gap in the walls. You spend long hours sitting close to the fire, if you have fuel to burn, telling stories to pass the time, or simply sitting in companionable silence as the wind howls outside. But let's return to this day, this particular morning in 1294. By the time the sun has climbed high enough to cast short shadows, your stomach is beginning to remind you that one bowl of bread and ale will not sustain you through hours of heavy labor. If you're fortunate, if your wife has had time between her own endless tasks of tending the vegetable plot and spinning wool and caring for the children, there might be something waiting for you at midday. You walk home along the narrow path that connects your cottage to the field, your feet knowing every rut and stone. The smell reaches you before you see the cottage, wood smoke, yes, but also something cooking. Your pace quickens just a little, and you find your wife stirring a pot that hangs over the rekindled fire. Steam rises from the dark liquid within, carrying the scent of barley and peas, and if the saints have smiled upon you, a bone with perhaps a scrap of meat still clinging to it, this is pottage, the meal that appears on your table more often than any other. So often that your life might be measured in bowls of pottage rather than years. It's a thick soup, really, made from whatever grains and vegetables and scraps are available. Today it's barley, pearl barley if you've been able to afford it. Hulled barley if not, cooked until it swells and thickens the broth. There are dried peas in it, the small, hard peas that were stored from last year's harvest, now softened by long cooking until they break apart and add their own starchy richness to the mixture. And there, floating like a promise, in the golden brown liquid, is a bone. Not a meaty bone, those are for feast days and celebrations, but a knuckle bone from the pig that was slaughtered last autumn, a bone that has given up most of its substance. It's all ready, but still has something to offer. It's been cracked to release what little marrow remains, and it bobbles gently in the simmering pottage, adding a faint richness, ghost of flavor that transforms this simple mixture of grain and vegetables into something that approaches satisfaction. Your wife ladles the pottage into your wooden bowl, and you accept it gratefully, blowing on the surface to cool it enough to eat. There's no spoon. Spoons are for those wealthy enough to afford them. So you tip the bowl to your lips and drink the thin part. Then use a crust of bread to push the thicker bits into your mouth. The barley is chewy and filling. The peas add their own earthy sweetness. And the bone has left just enough fat floating on the surface to make the whole thing feel like more than just hot water and grain. With the pottage comes another piece of bread. This one baked fresh this morning if you're lucky, day old if you're not. It's the same dark, coarse rye bread that started your day, but it serves a different purpose now. You tear it apart and use it to soak up the last of the pottage from your bowl. Waste not, want not, every crumb precious and accounted for. As you eat, you notice the texture of everything, how the barley catches between your teeth, how the bread crumbles, and sometimes reveals small stones from the millstone where it was ground, how the thin ale you drink with your meal has tiny bits of grain floating in it. Your diet is not just about taste, though taste matters when you have so little variety. It's about texture and substance, about the feeling of fullness, however temporary, and the knowledge that you've consumed enough fuel to keep your body working through the afternoon's labor. The afternoon brings you back to the field, back to whatever task the season demands. Your stomach is settled now, quiet, allowing you to focus on the work at hand. But as the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon, as the shadows grow longer and the air grows cooler, you begin to think about the evening meal. Will there be pottage again? Probably. Will there be bread? If the grain holds out, will there be anything else? A bit of cheese, perhaps? Or an egg from one of the hens? Only if fortune smiles. You return home as the light fades, your body aching from the day's labor, your clothes damp with sweat despite the cool air. The cottage feels smaller after a day in the open fields, but it's warm, or warmer at least, and it smells of home. Your wife has been busy while you worked, not just with her own labor, but with the preparation of the evening meal. The pot still hangs over the fire. Whatever was cooking at midday has been simmering slowly all afternoon, growing thicker and more concentrated. But evening meals are different from midday meals, governed by different rules and different possibilities. If it's been a good day, if there are leftovers from the midday pottage, they might be reheated and stretched with a bit more water or ale. If it's been a lean day, the evening might bring nothing more than bread and whatever remains of the morning's ale. Sometimes there's porridge made from oats, a thin, bland gruel that fills your stomach without satisfying your spirit. But filling is more important than satisfying when hunger is your constant companion. Tonight, let's imagine there's a small miracle on your rough wooden table. Along with the inevitable bread and the bowl of reheated pottage, there's a small wedge of cheese. Not much cheese, perhaps as much as you could hold between your thumb and forefinger, but cheese, nonetheless. It's hard cheese, aged through the summer, with a sharp bite that makes your mouth water, dividing it between yourself and your wife and your children, each person receiving just enough to taste, to remember what richness feels like on the tongue. The cheese comes from your own goat, the one animal that provides for your family beyond the occasional egg from the hens. The goat gives milk when she's not too old or too tired or too poorly fed. And from that milk, when there's enough to spare from drinking, comes cheese. Making cheese is a mystery your wife has learned from her mother, who learned it from her mother before her. A alchemy of milk and rennet and time that transforms something liquid and perishable into something solid and lasting. But even this small luxury comes with its own anxieties. The cheese represents milk that won't be drunk, nutrients that won't be immediately available to your growing children. Every choice about food is a choice about survival. Every meal a careful calculation of what you have, and what you need and what you can afford to consume today versus what you might need tomorrow. As the evening deepens and the fire burns lower, you and your family gather around the table for this simple meal. There's no ceremony, no elaborate grace, just the quiet appreciation of people who understand that food is never guaranteed. You break the bread with your hands. There are no knives at this table except for the one knife your family owns, the one that serves as tool and weapon and eating implement all in one. The bread tears apart to reveal its dense, dark interior, flecked with pieces of grain, hull, and the occasional bit of grit from the millstone. You've grown up with this texture, this flavor, and while you might dream sometimes of the white bread that graces the Lord's table, this dark bread is what sustains you. It's heavy and filling, and when you dip it in the pottage or spread it with a tiny scraping of cheese, it becomes something approaching delicious. The children eat first, always. There's not enough food for everyone, and there often isn't. The children eat, and the adults make do with what remains. It's not a rule anyone discusses, it's simply the way things are. Children need more food relative to their size, and children represent the future of the family, the pair of hands that will work the field and tend the fire when you re too old or too sick to do it yourself. You watch your oldest son, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, as he carefully tears his bread into small pieces, making it last longer. He's learned already the hard lesson of scarcity, the discipline of eating slowly so that the meal seems more substantial than it is. His younger sister, maybe 5, hasn't learned this lesson yet and gulps down her portion quickly, then looks around hopefully for more. There is no more, but no one scolds her. She'll learn, as you learned, as everyone learns who grows up with hunger as a constant companion. Your wife eats last after ensuring that everyone else has had their share. She's thin, thinner than she should be, but then most women in your situation are thin. Pregnancy and childbirth and the endless labor of running a household on nothing more than scraps and determination have worn her down. But she's strong in ways that matter. She knows how to make a turnip and a handful of barley into something that resembles a meal. She knows how to spin wool and weave cloth and tend a sick child and keep a fire burning through a long winter night. She knows how to survive. After the meal, there's the ritual of cleaning up, though cleaning up is a simple matter when you own so few dishes and cook in just one pot. The bowls are wiped clean with the last crusts of bread. Nothing is wasted, nothing is left behind. The pot is scraped clean and set aside to be cleaned properly in the morning, when there's water to spare for the task. as the fire burns down to embers, as the children settle onto their straw mattresses in the corner of the room. You might allow yourself a moment to think about tomorrow's meals. Is there enough grain to make bread? Will the pottage stretch to feed everyone? Or will it need to be thinned with more water? Are there any vegetables left in the plot beside the cottage? A turnip, perhaps? Or a leek that survived the last frost? These are the calculations that occupy your mind as you settle down for the night. Not grand plans or distant dreams, but the immediate pressing concerns of survival. How to turn what you have into enough. How to make it through another day, another week, another season. How to keep your family fed and healthy on a diet that would horrify anyone living in comfort, but which represents the daily reality for most of the people in your world. Sleep comes eventually bringing with it dreams that might feature the white bread of the Lord's table, or the sweet luxury of honey, or the impossible richness of meat that is unjust a bone floating in a pot of grain. But dreams cost nothing, and you wake each morning to the same simple truth. You have what you have, you eat what you can get, and you're grateful for both, because the alternative is worse than you care to imagine. The rhythm of your days continues, season after season, year after year. In spring, there are wild greens to supplement the stored grain. Dandelion leaves and nettle tops, and whatever else the forest floor offers to those desperate enough to gather it. In summer, if you're fortunate, there might be a few vegetables from your own small plot, carefully tended between the demands of working the Lord's fields. In autumn, there's the harvest, and with it the brief abundance that must be carefully preserved to last through the winter. And in winter, there's the quiet desperation of making what you have last until spring returns. This is your life, measured in meals and seasons and the endless patient work of survival. It's a hard life, a hungry life, but it's the only life you know. And in its own way, there's a strange peace in its simplicity, a deep satisfaction in the knowledge that you've earned every bite through your own labor, that every meal, however humble, represents a victory against hunger and want and the thousand dangers that threaten those who live close to the edge of survival. As the evening mist settles over our imagined medieval village, let us drift our attention from the anonymous peasant's cottage to another dwelling. It's not far away, where a different kind of survival unfolds. Here lives a woman whose name has somehow survived the centuries, not because she was noble or wealthy, but because she appeared in the manor court roles often enough that history could not quite forget her. Agnes of Ely lived and died in the late 13th century, in a small village that clustered around the great cathedral, like chicks around a hen. She was what the records call an alewife, a woman who brewed and sold ale to her neighbors. And in the fragments of parchment that preserve her memory, we can glimpse a life lived on the very edge of possibility, sustained by grain and water and yeast, and an iron determination that refused to bend, even when everything else did. Picture Agnes on a morning much like the one we've just left behind, but her awakening is different. She rises not to work another's land, but to tend to the great wooden vats that stand like patient soldiers in the corner of her cottage. The smell that greets her is not the cold ash of a dead hearth, but the sweet, yeasty perfume of fermentation. The mysterious alchemy that transforms simple barley into the liquid bread that keeps her small world turning. Agnes became an alewife, not by choice, but by necessity. When her husband died, and the records don't tell us how, whether it was fever or accident, or simply the wearing down that comes from too many years of too little food, she found herself in that precarious position occupied by so many medieval widows. The land they had worked together reverted to the Lord, for it had never truly been theirs. The cottage remained hers, but a cottage without land is like a boat without oars. It might provide shelter, but it cannot provide sustenance. She had 4 children then, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 14. 4 mouths that opened each morning expecting to be fed. 4 bodies that needed clothing and warmth, and the kind of security that comes from knowing there will be a tomorrow and a day after that, and meals to fill them both. The law gave her a few options. She could remarry, surrendering her small independence to another man's authority. She could try to survive on charity, becoming a burden to neighbors who had little enough to spare. Or she could find a way to earn her bread through her own labor. Brewing chose her as much as she chose brewing. In her part of England, in that time, ale was not a luxury but a necessity. Water, even from the best wells, carried dangers that everyone understood but no one could explain. The mysterious illnesses that struck down the strong and the weak alike. The fevers that came from drinking what looked clean and pure but harbored invisible threats. Ale, with its alcohol content however mild, killed whatever might harm you. It was liquid food, liquid safety, liquid life. The process Agnes learned was ancient even then. It's passed down from mother to daughter through generations, stretching back into the mists of pre-Christian England. It began with malted barley. Barley that had been soaked until it sprouted, then dried to stop the sprouting. A process that converted the grain's starches into sugars that yeast could consume. Agnes would buy this malted barley when she could afford it, or make it herself when she couldn't. Spreading the damp grain on the floor of her cottage and waiting for those tiny green shoots to appear like promises of spring. The brewing itself happened in stages that required both patience and precision. First, the malted barley was ground, not as fine as flour, but coarse enough to release its sugars. Then it was mixed with hot water in her largest wooden vat, stirred until it became a thick porridge-like mixture called the mash. The temperature had to be just right. Too hot and the yeast would die. Too cool and the sugars wouldn't extract properly. Agnes learned to judge the temperature, not with instruments, which she could never afford but with her finger and her experience. Feeling for that perfect warmth that meant the difference between success and a week worth of wasted grain. The mash would sit for hours, sometimes overnight, while the hot water pulled every bit of sweetness from the grain. Then came the straining, ladling the liquid through wicker baskets or cloth, separating the sweet brown wort from the spent grain. The grain wasn't wasted, of course. Nothing ever was. It went to the pigs. If Agnes had pigs, or was mixed into bread, or became part of a pottage that would feed her children when there was little else. The wort, meanwhile, would be brought to a gentle boil, sometimes with herbs added for flavor or preservation. Bog myrtle if it grew nearby, or horehound, or whatever else local tradition and available plants suggested. Agnes might have known about hops, which were beginning to be used in some parts of England. But they were expensive and not yet common in her region. Her ales were flavored by the grain itself and whatever wild herbs she could gather from the hedgerows. Then came the waiting that required the most faith, the addition of yeast and the slow magic of fermentation. Agnes kept her yeast alive in the bottom of barrels from previous batches, a living culture that connected each new brewing to all the brewings that had come before. She would add this thick, foamy sediment to the cooled wort, and cover the vat with cloth and wait for the bubbling to begin. That soft, continuous whispering that meant the yeast was eating the sugars and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide, transforming simple grain water into something that could sustain life. In 3 or 4 days, if all went well, Agnes would have ale, not the strong hoppy beer we know today, but a mild, slightly sweet, cloudy liquid that tasted of bread and earth and the faint wildness of fermentation. It was alive in a way that modern beverages are not, still working, still changing, with a shelf life measured in days rather than months. But making the ale was only half of Agnes's work. She also had to sell it, and selling meant dealing with a world that was not particularly welcoming to women trying to earn their own bread. The medieval ale trade was regulated in ways that seem almost impossibly complex today. Agnes had to announce when she was brewing, hanging an ale stake outside her door, a long pole with a bushy bundle tied to the end. To let her neighbors know that fresh ale would soon be available, she had to sell her ale at prices set not by what she needed to charge to make a profit, but by what the local authorities decided was fair. These prices were announced at regular intervals and were expected to remain stable, regardless of the cost of grain or fuel, or any other factor that might affect Agnes's ability to turn a profit. When grain was expensive, Agnes made less money per gallon. When it was cheap, she made more, but grain was rarely cheap enough to make brewing truly profitable. More challenging still were the quality controls imposed by the manor court and the church. Tasters appointed by the local authorities would appear at Agnes's door without warning to sample her wares and judge their quality. Too weak and she might be fined for cheating her customers. It's too strong, and she might be accused of encouraging drunkenness. Too expensive, and she was profiteering. Too cheap, and she was accused of unfair competition with her neighbors. The records that preserve Agnes's name are mostly records of these fines and accusations. In the manor court rolls for her village, her name appears again and again. Agnes the alewife presented for selling ale contrary to the assize, meaning she charged more than the legal price. Agnes the alewife fined sixpence for brewing with unclean vessels, a charge that might mean her equipment was genuinely dirty, or might mean she had offended someone with influence. Agnes the alewife to be in mercy for default, meaning she failed to appear in court when summoned. Perhaps because she was brewing and couldn't leave her vats, or perhaps because she simply couldn't afford the day's lost income. Each fine was a small catastrophe in Agnes's carefully balanced world. Sixpence might not sound like much, but when your profit from a week's brewing might be only a shilling or two, losing sixpence to a court fine meant choosing between feeding your children and buying grain for the next batch of ale. It meant borrowing from neighbors who had little to spare, or selling possessions you could not afford to lose, or finding some other way to make up the difference that probably involved more risk and more potential fines. Yet Agnes persisted, batch after batch, season after season. The records suggest she brewed year-round, which was unusual. Many alewives only brewed occasionally, when they had extra grain or needed quick money. But Agnes seems to have made brewing her primary occupation, the foundation upon which her family's survival rested. This meant she had to find ways to obtain grain even when the harvest was poor to keep her yeast alive, even when fuel for heating was scarce to maintain. Her reputation and her customer base, even when the ale-testers seemed determined to find fault with her work, her customers were her neighbors. Other villagers who needed ale for their daily meals and who had a few coins or some other goods to trade for it. Medieval commerce was not always about money changing hands. Agnes might accept a day's labor in her small garden in exchange for a gallon of ale, or take eggs from a customer's hens, or barley from someone's store, or firewood cut from the common lands. These barter arrangements were recorded nowhere. They were probably essential to Agnes's survival and to the survival of her customers as well. The ale Agnes brewed was not just a beverage but a food, consumed by adults and children alike, from breakfast through dinner. It provided calories, B vitamins, and a measure of safety in a world where clean water was never guaranteed. For her customers, Agnes's ale might represent the difference between an adequate diet and real hunger. For Agnes herself, the grain she used in brewing was grain she could not eat directly, a calculated risk that the profit from selling ale would allow her to buy more food than the grain would have provided if simply made into bread. And what did Agnes herself eat? This woman who transformed grain into gold, or at least into the copper coins that bought survival? The records don't tell us directly, but we can imagine. On good days when the ales sold well and the fines were few, she might have shared some of the better customers' prosperity. A bit of cheese, perhaps, or an egg, or even a small piece of meat on a holy day. On bad days, she'd probably survived on the thin, sour ale that remained at the bottom of her barrels, mixed with whatever bread she could afford to make from the cheapest grain. Agnes likely grew some of her own food in the small plot that surrounded her cottage. Turnips and leeks and onions, the hardy vegetables that could survive with minimal care while she tended to her brewing. She might have kept a pig, feeding it on the spent grain from her ales and slaughtering it in the autumn to provide preserved meat through the winter months. She might have had chickens, providing eggs and eventually meat, or a goat for milk that could be drunk fresh or made into cheese. But all of these possibilities depended on having enough success in her primary trade to afford the initial investment. A pig cost money to buy, even a piglet. Chickens needed grain to supplement what they could forage. A goat needed hay through the winter. Each additional source of food required resources that Agnes might not have been able to spare from the delicate balance of her brewing business. The record suggests that Agnes's prosperity varied dramatically from year to year and season to season. In some court roles, she appears as a successful businesswoman, fined for technical violations but clearly operating a thriving trade. In others, she appears as someone struggling to pay even small fines, borrowing money from neighbors, falling behind on her obligations to the manor court. This variability was probably typical for medieval small businesses, a constant cycle of feast and famine, success and setback, determined as much by weather and politics and pure luck as by skill and effort. As Agnes aged, the physical demands of brewing must have become more challenging. The constant lifting of heavy buckets of water and grain, the stirring of thick mashes, the long hours spent standing over hot vats, all of this would have taken its toll on a woman who was probably not well nourished to begin with. and who had borne and raised 4 children in an age when childbirth was dangerous and childhood mortality was high. The last references to Agnes in the court rolls suggest a woman whose business was declining, whose ability to compete with younger brewers was diminishing. There are more fines for poor quality ale, more failures to appear in court, more indications that she was struggling to maintain the standards that had once made her successful. But even in decline, she continued brewing, continued trying to transform grain and water and yeast into the liquid that kept her family alive. Agnes died, as most people of her time died, without leaving any record of her thoughts or feelings or dreams. We don't know if she ever imagined a different life for herself or her children, if she resented the constant struggle or took pride in her ability to survive it, if she found joy in the alchemy of brewing or saw it merely as a necessary burden. We know her only through the dry legal language of court records, fines paid and unpaid, regulations violated, obligations met or ignored. But in those sparse records, we can read a story of incredible resilience. Agnes lived in a world that gave women few choices and fewer resources. Yet she carved out a space for herself and her family. Through skill and determination and the willingness to transform simple ingredients into something more valuable than the sum of their parts. She took grain and water, the basic elements of survival, and made them into something that could be sold, traded, used to build a life, however modest. Her ales probably tasted nothing like the beers we know today. They were cloudy and slightly sweet, with a low alcohol content and a short shelf life. They might have been flavored with herbs we no longer use, or might have carried the taste of smoke from the fire that heated the brewing water, or the faint temps of the wooden vessels in which they fermented. But for Agnes and her customers, these ales represented something precious: safety in a dangerous world, nutrition when food was scarce, and the social bonds that formed around shared meals and shared drinks. Agnes's story reminds us that behind every meal in the medieval world stood someone like her. Someone who transformed raw ingredients into sustenance, who took risks and faced challenges and persisted despite setbacks. The ale she brewed became part of the daily diet of everyone in her village, as essential as bread and nearly as common. In a world where hunger was always possible and safety was never guaranteed, Agnes and women like her provided one of the few certainties available: that as long as there was grain and water and yeast, there would be ale, and as long as there was ale, there was hope for another day, another meal, another small victory against the forces that threatened to overwhelm the lives of ordinary people. Let us drift now from the warmth of Agnes's alehouse into the cool, dusty silence of an archaeological site where the earth itself holds secrets about how our ancestors truly lived and ate. Picture, if you will, a gray morning in 1987 somewhere in the ancient city of York, where construction workers preparing to lay foundations for a new shopping center have instead uncovered something far more precious than retail space: a medieval rubbish pit, a midden heap that has been sealed away from light and air for more than 7 centuries. The archaeologists who arrived to investigate this accidental discovery work with brushes and trowels, carefully exposing layer after layer of accumulated refuse. They find the expected things: broken pottery, scraps of leather, the bones of animals that were once someone's dinner. But among these familiar remnants of medieval life, they uncover something puzzling, something that doesn't quite fit the usual patterns of archaeological finds. Scattered throughout the refuse pit are hundreds of bread crusts, preserved by some quirk of chemistry and circumstance, still recognizable after all these centuries. But these are not ordinary bread crusts when the archaeologists examine them more closely. When they take samples back to their laboratories and peer at them under microscopes, they discover something extraordinary and disturbing. Mixed into the very fabric of these bread crusts, ground so fine it's barely visible to the naked eye, are fragments of bone. Not just any bone, but animal bone that has been carefully processed, cleaned, dried, and ground into a powder so fine it could be mixed with flour. The bones come from various animals: cattle, sheep, pigs, and they've been treated not as ingredients for soup or stew, but as a supplement to the grain that formed the foundation of medieval bread. Someone, centuries ago, was deliberately adding bone meal to their bread dough, transforming what should have been simple grain and water into something more complex and troubling. The question that haunts the archaeologists is simple and impossible. Why? Why would anyone choose to mix powdered bone into their daily bread? The practice seems to go against every instinct we have about food. Every assumption we make about what constitutes nourishment versus what constitutes desperation. Yet here is the evidence, preserved in the earth itself, suggesting that for at least some people in medieval York, bone-filled bread was not an aberration, but a regular part of their diet. Let us imagine ourselves into that world, into that choice, trying to understand what might drive someone to grind bones and mix them with flour. Perhaps we begin with desperation, the kind of hunger that makes any source of calories, however strange, seem worth trying. Medieval famines were not rare events, but recurring catastrophes that swept across Europe like waves, destroying crops and leaving entire populations on the edge of starvation. During these famines, people ate things that would horrify us today. Tree bark, ground and mixed with whatever grain could be found. Grass and weeds boiled into thin soups that provided bulk if not nutrition. Leather, softened by long boiling until it could be chewed and swallowed. Against this background of desperate improvisation, grinding bones and mixing them with flour begins to seem less shocking and more logical. Another way to extract every possible bit of nutrition from whatever materials were available. But bone meal and bread might not have been purely about desperation. Bones, after all, do contain nutrients that medieval people might have recognized, even if they couldn't explain them scientifically. Calcium, certainly, which would have been valuable in a diet that contained little dairy. Phosphorus, which helps the body use other nutrients more effectively. Trace minerals that might have provided subtle benefits to people whose diets were monotonously limited to grain and vegetables. Medieval people were not ignorant about nutrition, even if their understanding was expressed in different terms than ours. They knew that certain foods made them feel stronger, that others helped them recover from illness, that variety in diet was generally better than monotony. It's possible that bone meal was deliberately added to bread, not out of desperation, but out of a kind of folk wisdom that recognized its nutritional value. There's another possibility, stranger and more disturbing. The bones might have been added not for nutrition, but as a form of adulteration, a way for dishonest millers or bakers to stretch their expensive grain with cheaper materials. Medieval commerce was full of such fraud. Bakers mixed chalk with flour to make it whiter and apparently more valuable. Brewers watered their ale to increase their profits. Merchants sold spices cut with sawdust or ground stones. In this context, bone meal becomes not a nutritional supplement, but a form of theft, a way to sell bread that contained less grain than the customer was paying for, while maintaining the appearance and perhaps even the weight of genuine bread. The bones would have been essentially free, gathered from butcher shops or kitchens and processed at minimal cost, then mixed with flour in proportions that maximized profit while minimizing the risk of detection. But if bone meal was a form of fraud, it was remarkably sophisticated fraud. The bones found in the York bread had been carefully cleaned and processed, ground to a fineness that suggests considerable effort and skill. This wasn't a matter of simply throwing scraps into the dough, but of deliberately creating a powder that could be seamlessly integrated into bread without obviously changing its texture or appearance. The processing itself would have been laborious. Bones would need to be cleaned of all meat and cartilage, then dried thoroughly to prevent spoilage. They would need to be broken into small pieces, then ground repeatedly until they achieved the fine powder consistency found in the archaeological samples. This grinding might have been done with the same cornstones used for grain, or with specialized equipment designed for the purpose. Imagine the sound of bones being ground in some medieval workshop, the slow rhythmic scraping of stone against stone, the gradual transformation of hard bone into fine powder. Imagine the smell, dusty and slightly sweet, with undertones that spoke of death and decay, transformed into something that could be consumed by the living. The work would have been dusty and unpleasant, coating the worker in fine bone powder that would get into their hair and clothes and probably their lungs. Yet someone did this work repeatedly and skillfully, producing enough bone meal to supply what appears to have been a substantial bread-baking operation. The sheer quantity of bone-filled bread crusts found in the York midden suggests that this was not an isolated experiment or a desperate measure taken during a brief famine, but a regular practice that continued long enough to generate significant archaeological evidence. The mystery deepens when we consider the social context of medieval bread consumption. Bread was not just food, but a marker of social status and economic position. White bread, made from carefully sifted wheat flour, was the privilege of the wealthy. Dark bread, made from rye or barley or mixed grains, was the staple of ordinary people. The poorest might eat bread made from beans or peas, or bread stretched with sawdust or other adulterants. Where does bone-filled bread fit into this hierarchy? Was it imposed on the poorest consumers, people who had no choice but to accept whatever bread they could afford? Or was it perhaps presented as a premium product, bread enhanced with special ingredients that provided additional nutrition? The archaeological evidence can't answer these questions directly, but it suggests that bone-filled bread was common enough to be a regular part of someone's diet, rather than an emergency measure used only in times of crisis. There's something almost alchemical about the practice of grinding bones and mixing them with flour, a transformation that echoes the medieval fascination with changing one substance into another. Medieval people lived in a world where transformation was both common and mysterious. Grain became bread through the action of yeast. Milk became cheese through the addition of rennet. Grape juice became wine through fermentation. In this context, the transformation of bones into food might have seemed not shocking, but natural. Another example of human ingenuity, finding ways to extract nourishment from unlikely sources. But there's also something deeply unsettling about the practice, something that touches on fundamental questions about what we consider food, and what we consider waste, what nourishes us, and what disgusts us. The boundary between food and non-food is not as clear as we might like to think, and medieval people seem to have drawn that boundary in places that make us uncomfortable. The bones in the bread represent a kind of recycling that we've largely abandoned in our modern world, where we have the luxury of throwing away materials that our ancestors would have found precious. Medieval people couldn't afford such waste. Every part of every animal had potential value: meat for immediate consumption, fat for cooking and lighting, hide for leather, bones for tools and glue, and apparently food. This recycling extended beyond bones to every aspect of medieval life. Clothes were mended and remade until they fell apart, then used as rags and eventually as tinder for starting fires. Food scraps went to animals, and animal waste fertilized the gardens that grew the next season's food. Nothing was truly waste in a world where scarcity was the normal condition and abundance was a brief, precious exception. Yet even in this context of comprehensive recycling, bone-filled bread seems extreme. It crosses a line that most of us would find difficult to cross, even in desperate circumstances. The fact that medieval people apparently crossed this line regularly, skillfully, and on a substantial scale tells us something important about the realities of their lives and the choices they faced. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the bone-filled bread mystery is how little we really know about it. The archaeological evidence is clear. The bones are there, ground fine, and mixed into bread that was eaten by real people in a real medieval city. But the documentary evidence is almost non-existent. No medieval recipes survive that call for bone meal as an ingredient. No court records mention prosecutions for selling adulterated bread containing bones. No chronicles describe famines so severe that people resorted to eating bones. This silence in the written record is itself significant. Medieval people wrote extensively about many aspects of food and cooking, elaborate recipes for feast dishes, regulations governing the quality of bread and ale, moral treatises on gluttony and fasting. The absence of any mention of bone-filled bread suggests either that the practice was so common it did unseem worth recording, or so shameful that people preferred not to write about it. The silence might also reflect the fact that written records were primarily created by and for the elite, people who could afford white bread and meat, and all the luxuries that made bone meal unnecessary. Poor, who might have been the primary consumers of bone-filled bread, left few written records of their lives and experiences. Their stories survive mainly in archaeological fragments like these bread crusts, material evidence that speaks when documents are silent. As we drift through this mystery, trying to understand what it means and why it matters, we're reminded of how much about medieval life remains unknown and unknowable. We can analyze the bones in the bread. We can speculate about the reasons for their presence. We can imagine the people who ate this strange food and the circumstances that led them to accept it. But ultimately, the mystery remains a mystery, a puzzle that connects us to people whose experiences were so different from ours. that we can barely comprehend the choices they made. The bone-filled bread of medieval York stands as a testament to human adaptability, to the lengths people will go to survive in difficult circumstances, and to the complex relationship between necessity and choice in the lives of our ancestors. It reminds us that our comfortable assumptions about food and nutrition and what constitutes acceptable eating are luxuries that most people throughout most of history could not afford. And perhaps, as we settle deeper into sleep, we can find a strange comfort in this reminder of human resilience. The people who ate bone-filled bread survived to leave their traces in the archaeological record. They found ways to extract nutrition from the most unlikely sources, to transform waste into sustenance, to continue living even when the choices available to them seem almost impossibly difficult from our modern perspective. Their story, preserved in fragments of ancient bread, speaks to the fundamental human capacity to adapt, to survive, to find ways forward, even when the path is unclear and the destination uncertain. In their quiet desperation and their stubborn persistence, we can perhaps recognize something of ourselves, some echo of the resourcefulness and determination that has carried our species through countless challenges and will carry us through whatever challenges lie ahead. As our journey through medieval hunger and hardship draws toward its gentle close, let us drift upward through the social hierarchy. From the cottage where peasants chew their dark bread, to the great hall where lords feast on delicacies that would seem magical to those who labor in the fields below. Here in these stone-walled chambers, warmed by great hearths and lit by countless candles, we encounter a world of abundance so extreme it seems almost fantastical. A world where food is not just sustenance, but art performance and the very expression of power itself. Picture yourself climbing the narrow stone steps of a manor house on a winter evening in that same year of 1294. The steps are worn smooth by centuries of feet, and torches flicker in iron brackets along the walls, casting dancing shadows that seem to move with lives of their own. As you ascend, the temperature gradually warms, and the smell that reaches your nostrils is nothing like the simple, familiar scent of peasant pottage or the yeasty aroma of Agnes's alehouse. This is the perfume of luxury. Roasted meat, rich with herbs and spices that have traveled thousands of miles. Sweet wine warmed with honey and cinnamon, fresh bread so white it seems to glow in the candlelight. It's a symphony of aromas that speaks of abundance, of resources so plentiful they can be transformed into pleasure rather than merely used for survival. The great hall opens before you like a vision from another world. The ceiling soars overhead, supported by massive wooden beams that were trees when your grandfather was young. Tapestries hang from the walls, their colors still bright despite the smoke that perpetually fills the air. But it's the long tables that draw your attention. Heavy oak planks supported by carved legs, covered with linen cloths so white they seem to have been woven from clouds. The Lord sits at the high table, elevated above the rest of the hall, both literally and symbolically. He is perhaps 40 years old, which makes him ancient by the standards of his time, but his face is round and well-fed, his clothes rich with fur and fine cloth. His wife sits beside him, her gown trailing on the floor behind her chair, her fingers heavy with rings that catch the candlelight and throw it back in tiny rainbows. Before them, the feast unfolds in courses that seem to multiply without end. The first course alone contains more variety than a peasant might see in a year. Roasted swan stuffed with smaller birds, its neck curved gracefully, as if it were still alive and swimming on some celestial pond. Venison from deer that were hunted in the Lord's private forest, the meat dark and rich, seasoned with pepper, that cost more per ounce than a peasant earned in a week. There are fish, too, despite this being a meat course, great pike from the Lord's private ponds. Their scales removed, but their shape intact, arranged on silver platters, as if they were swimming through a sea of sauce. Le eel, the delicacy so prized, it was said to be the food of kings, cooked in wine and spices until it gleamed like jewels in the candlelight. Salt cod from the distant northern seas, its preservation representing a triumph of trade, and commerce that connects this inland hall to fishermen working in waters so cold they freeze a man's breath. But it's not just the variety of the food that marks this meal as extraordinary. It's the transformation that wealth and skill have worked upon these simple ingredients. The bread that accompanies this feast is not the dark, coarse rye that sustains the peasants, but pure white wheat bread, sifted through cloths so fine that only the most refined flour remains. It's soft and light, almost weightless in your hand, with a crust that crackles when you break it and releases a cloud of steam that carries. The scent of grain transformed into something approaching perfection. The wine, and there is wine here, not just ale, comes from vineyards in distant lands, transported in great casks at enormous expense and risk. It's red and rich, warming the throat as it goes down, flavored with spices that have traveled even farther than the wine itself. Cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from islands so remote their names are known only to merchants, and mapmaker's ginger that grew in soil warmed by tropical suns that never shine on this northern manor. As the first course gives way to the second, the excess becomes almost dreamlike in its abundance. Peacocks roasted, and then carefully redressed in their own feathers, so they appear alive and magnificent, even as they're carved for eating. Boars' heads glazed with honey and decorated with herbs, their tusks polished until they gleam, their dead eyes replaced with gilded ornaments that stare blindly over the assembled feast. There are sweets, too, something almost unknown to peasant palates. Honey cakes shaped like castles and knights, their surfaces golden and gleaming. Candied fruits preserved in sugar that costs more than silver. Their natural flavors concentrated and intensified until each bite explodes with sweetness. Marzipan molded into fantastic shapes. Flowers that never grew in any earthly garden. Animals that exist only in heraldic imagination. Geometrical forms that speak of the order and control that wealth can impose upon even the most basic human needs. The servants who move between the tables, carrying platters and refilling goblets, are themselves better fed than most free peasants. Their clothes are clean and well-mended, their faces round with regular meals. Their movements quick and efficient because they know their positions depend on pleasing their betters. They eat the scraps from the Lord's table. But these scraps would constitute a feast in any peasant cottage, bits of meat still, clinging to bones that have been gnawed by aristocratic teeth. Bread trenchers soaked with the juices of exotic dishes, wine that remains in cups when the drinkers are too full to finish it. Between the courses, there's entertainment that itself involves food. Jugglers toss apples and pears in complex patterns, the fruit flying through the air like edible stars. Musicians sing songs about great feasts of the past, or lyrics praising the generosity of lords and the abundance of harvests. Acrobats perform tricks that require the kind of strength and energy that comes only from regular, abundant feeding. But perhaps the most striking aspect of this feast is not the food itself, but the rituals that surround it. Every dish is presented with ceremony, every course announced with fanfare. Servants taste each dish before it reaches the Lord's lips. Not just for poison, but to demonstrate that the food is worthy of aristocratic consumption. The carving of meat becomes a performance art, with special knives and elaborate techniques that transform simple butchery into something approaching dance. The contrast with peasant eating habits could not be more complete. Where peasants eat with their fingers from wooden bowls, the nobles use knives and spoons made of silver, and drink from goblets that are themselves works of art. Where peasants consume their meals in silence, focused entirely on the business of getting enough nutrition to sustain life, the nobles turn eating into social performance. A demonstration of wealth and power and cultural sophistication, yet there's something almost desperate in this excess. Something that suggests not confidence but anxiety. The sheer abundance of the feast seems designed not just to nourish, but to overwhelm, to create an impression of plenty so complete that scarcity becomes unimaginable. Every dish seems to shout, "Look what we can afford to consume." Every course proclaims, "See how far we are from hunger." This desperate quality becomes more apparent when we consider the seasonal nature of even aristocratic abundance. This winter feast represents the consumption of resources that were gathered and preserved through the warmer months. When hunting was good and trade routes were open in the countryside, it supported the complex logistics required to maintain aristocratic lifestyle. Come spring, even the Lord's table will grow simpler, more dependent on preserved foods and less exotic ingredients. The preservation techniques that make winter feasting possible are themselves markers of wealth and privilege. The salt that preserves the meat costs more than most peasants see in a year. The spices that flavor the preserved foods represent trade networks that span continents and involve risks and investments beyond the imagination of those who labor in the fields. The storage facilities required to maintain this abundance, the cellars and granaries and ice houses, present a level of infrastructure that only concentrated wealth can create and maintain. But even more significant than the techniques of preservation are the social relationships that make such abundance possible. Every dish on the Lord's table represents the labor of dozens or hundreds of people who will never taste such luxury themselves. The wheat and the white bread was grown by peasants who eat only dark rye. The meat was raised by serfs who taste flesh perhaps once a year on great religious festivals. The wine was made by vineyard workers who drink only the thin, sour stuff that remains after the best has been sent to market. This relationship between aristocratic luxury and peasant labor is not hidden but celebrated. The Lord's ability to command such abundance is seen as a mark of his worthiness to rule, proof that he has been blessed by God with the wisdom and authority necessary to manage the complex social hierarchies that make civilization possible. The feast becomes not just a meal but a demonstration of the natural order, a visible proof that some are born to command and others to serve. Yet even the most elaborate feast must end, and as the evening wears on, even aristocratic appetites reach their limits. The later courses become increasingly symbolic, more about display than consumption. Elaborate sugar sculptures that are admired but not eaten. Wines so rare and precious that they reserved in tiny portions just for the experience of tasting them. Dishes so complex and artificial that they're more art than food. The end of the feast brings its own rituals. The remaining food is distributed according to strict hierarchies, the best scraps to favored servants, lesser portions to other members of the household, the bones and truly inedible remains to the dogs that lounge beneath the tables. Nothing is truly wasted, but the definition of waste itself is different in a world where abundance is so extreme that perfectly good food can be discarded, because it's no longer hot or because it's been touched by someone of insufficient rank. As the Lord and his lady retire to their private chambers, aided by servants who will themselves feast on the remains of the evening's excess, we're left to contemplate the strange mathematics of medieval inequality. The resources consumed in this single meal could have fed a peasant family for months. The cost of the spices alone could have purchased grain enough to prevent starvation in an entire village. The wine that was casually poured and partially drunk represented wealth that could have bought freedom. For serfs or tools for farmers or any number of things, that would have improved the lives of those who actually produced the resources that made such feasting possible. Yet this inequality was not seen as a problem to be solved, but as a reflection of divine order, a necessary arrangement that allowed some to achieve the kind of cultural and artistic heights that such excess made possible. The feast was not just about eating, but about maintaining the social structures that kept medieval society functioning. However imperfectly, Lord's ability to command such abundance was also his ability to command the labor and loyalty of those who served him, to organize the complex agricultural and commercial networks that kept the medieval world from falling into complete chaos. And perhaps, in the quiet luxury of our modern abundance, we can find some sympathy for both sides of this ancient divide. The peasant's daily struggle for sufficient calories, constant calculation of scarcity against survival, the simple dignity of making do with whatever was available, these represent human virtues that our own age of plenty sometimes obscures. But the Lord's feast, for all its excess and inequality, also represents human achievements, worth celebrating the development of complex cuisines, the cultivation of taste and refinement, the creation of social occasions that elevated eating from mere survival to cultural expression. As we drift towards sleep, perhaps we can hold both realities in our minds without resolving the tension between them. The medieval world was harsh and unequal in ways that should not be romanticized or excused. But it was also a world where human beings found ways to create beauty and meaning even in the midst of scarcity and hardship, where the simplest meal could become a celebration and the most elaborate feast could express values and aspirations that transcended mere consumption. The great hall grows quiet now, the candles burning low, the servants clearing away the last remnants of the feast. Soon the fires will bank down to glowing embers, the tapestries will fade into shadow, the manor will settle into the deep quiet of medieval night. But somewhere in the village below, Agnes is checking her brewing vats one last time before sleep. I'm in cottages scattered across the countryside. Peasant families are banking their own small fires and settling onto their straw mattresses. Their stomachs perhaps not full, but their bodies weary enough that sleep will come despite hunger. They all sleep under the same stars, lord and peasant alike. Their dreams perhaps touched by the foods they've eaten or wished they could eat. Their rest perhaps deepened by the knowledge that they have survived another day in a world where survival was never guaranteed. And in the morning, they will wake to the same fundamental human needs for food, for warmth, for the simple continuance of life, that connect us across the centuries to their struggles and their satisfactions, their hunger and their abundance, their quiet desperation and their stubborn hope. And so our gentle journey through the medieval world of hunger and abundance draws to its close. Like the dying embers of a peasant's hearth settling into the soft gray ash of another day survived, another night welcomed, we have walked in worn leather shoes through muddy fields, felt the rough texture of dark bread between our teeth, tasted the thin comfort of small ale, and watched the flicker of candlelight on silver goblets that most could never hope to touch. 7 centuries separate us from those distant lives, yet the fundamental rhythms remain unchanged. The need for sustenance, the search for comfort, the quiet satisfaction that comes from a belly filled. And a family fed these connect us across the vast expanse of time to people whose names are mostly forgotten, but whose struggles we can still understand, whose small victories we can still celebrate. Think now of how far we have traveled, not just through the pages of history, but through the simple, profound act of eating. From that dawn awakening in a timber-framed cottage, breaking hard bread into weak ale, we have traced the threads that connected every meal to the larger tapestry of medieval life. We have seen how Agnes transformed grain into liquid gold, drop by precious drop, batch by careful batch. We have pondered the mystery of those who ground bones and mixed them with flour, driven by needs we can barely imagine. And we have glimpsed the abundance that wealth could create, even in an age when abundance was rare and precious. Each meal we encountered told a story not just of individual survival, but of the intricate web of relationships that held medieval society together. The peasant's pottage contained grain grown on the Lord's land, but seasoned with herbs gathered from common grounds where ancient rites allowed even the poorest to find what they needed. Agnes's ale flowed not just from her skill and determination, but from networks of trade and custom that connected her small cottage to the wider world of commerce and regulation. Even the mystery bread with its powdered bones spoke to relationships. Between those desperate enough to eat it and those skilled enough to prepare it, between those who would pay for such food and those who would provide it, the Lord's feast, for all its excess and inequality, also represented connections to hunters and farmers, to merchants and sailors, to all the countless hands that made such abundance possible. Every dish on that high table carried within it the labor and knowledge of people who would never taste such luxury themselves yet, whose contributions were essential to creating moments of beauty and celebration that lifted human experience above mere survival. What strikes us now, as we settle deeper into the comfort of our own abundance, is how much these medieval people accomplished with so little. They created complex flavors from simple ingredients, found ways to preserve food across seasons and years, developed brewing and baking techniques that sustained entire communities. They transformed necessity into art, scarcity into celebration, and basic survival into something approaching civilization. Their bread may have been coarse and dark, but it was bread nonetheless. Grain transformed by human knowledge and patience into something more nutritious and digestible than the raw materials from which it came. Their ale may have been weak and cloudy, but it was safe to drink and rich with the bee. Vitamins that prevented scurvy and sustained health through long winters when fresh food was impossible to find. Their pottage may have been simple, but it extracted every possible nutrient from whatever ingredients were available, wasting nothing and making everything count. Even their hungers were purposeful. Peasants' careful rationing, the alewife's calculated risks, the nobleman's seasonal feasting, all represented ways of managing resources across time, of planning for uncertainty, of creating stability in a world where stability was rare and precious. They understood in ways we sometimes forget that abundance is temporary and scarcity is always possible, that waste is a luxury few can afford, and that gratitude for what you have is more valuable than yearning for what you lack. As we drift towards sleep in our own warm beds, surrounded by our own abundance. We might pause to appreciate the simple miracles that our ancestors would have treasured. The clean water that flows from our taps would have seemed magical to people who knew that bad water could kill. The variety of foods available to us at any season would have overwhelmed people who ate the same basic dishes day after day, month after month. The safety of our food supply, the reliability of our meals, the knowledge that tomorrow's hunger is unlikely, these would have seemed like blessings beyond imagination to those who lived always on the edge of want. Yet there was something in their lives that we might envy, a direct connection between effort and sustenance, between labor and reward, that gave every meal a weight and meaning it rarely carries today. The peasant who ate bread made from grain, he had grown and harvested himself the alewife, who drank her own brewing. The lord who feasted on animals from his own forests. They all participated in food systems that connected them directly to the sources of their nourishment. They knew where their food came from because they had played a role in creating it. They understood the work that went into every loaf, every jug of ale, every piece of meat, because they had done that work themselves or watched others do it. They appreciated abundance when it came because they had experienced scarcity and understood how precious and temporary plenty could be. This connection to the sources of sustenance brought with it a kind of mindfulness about eating that we might learn from. Every grain was counted. Every scrap was saved. Every meal was an opportunity to be grateful for what was available rather than to wish for what was not. They ate with attention and intention because eating was too important to be done carelessly, too precious to be wasted on distraction. Their simplicity, too, offers lessons for our more complex age. The peasant's pottage, made from whatever was available and seasoned with whatever could be found, represents a kind of cooking that responds directly to circumstances, that finds flavor and satisfaction in the most basic combinations of ingredients. There's a wisdom in this adaptability, a creativity born of limitation, that can teach us to find abundance in simplicity rather than always seeking complexity in abundance. Agnes's determination to transform basic grains into something valuable enough to trade for survival reminds us that even the humblest work can be essential, that the people who provide our daily necessities are practicing arts that require real skill and knowledge. The mystery of the bone-filled bread, however disturbing it may seem to us, speaks to human resourcefulness and the willingness to find nutrition wherever it might exist, to waste nothing that might sustain life. Even the Lord's feast, excessive as it was, represented achievements worth celebrating. The development of sophisticated cooking techniques, the creation of complex flavors, the transformation of eating from mere necessity into cultural expression. The inequality it represented was wrong, but the artistry it fostered contributed to human knowledge and capability in ways that benefited more than just the wealthy. Find comfort in the knowledge that human beings have always found ways to nourish themselves and each other, even in the most difficult circumstances. The medieval world was harsh in ways that should not be romanticized, but it was also a world where people created meaning and beauty and community around the simple, essential act of sharing food. They gathered around fires and tables, broke bread and shared ale, told stories and sang songs that transformed mere eating into fellowship. They developed traditions and techniques that passed knowledge from generation to generation, ensuring that the wisdom needed for survival would not be lost. They found ways to celebrate abundance when it came, and to endure scarcity when it returned, creating rhythms of feast and fast that connected their daily lives to larger patterns of meaning and hope. In their quiet struggles and small triumphs, in their patient labor and stubborn persistence, we can recognize something of our own capacity for resilience and adaptation. The hunger they knew may be foreign to most of us, but the human qualities that enabled them to survive and sometimes even flourish are qualities we still possess and sometimes still need. Their bread may have been dark and coarse, but it sustained life and community across generations. Their ale may have been weak and cloudy, but it brought people together and made water safe to drink. Their simple meals may have lacked variety and abundance, but they nourished bodies and spirits through seasons of hardship and years of uncertainty. And now, as the medieval night settles over our imagined village, as the fires burn low in cottage and manor alike, as Agnes banks the coals beneath her brewing vats, and the Lord's servants clear away the last remnants of the feast, we too can settle into rest with the quiet satisfaction of having shared, however briefly, in lives that were different from our own, but recognizably human in their struggles and their hopes. The stars that shine down on our sleep are the same stars that shone on their rest. The fundamental needs that they met with such determination for food, for warmth, for community, for the simple continuation of life are needs we still share. The basic human capacity to find nourishment and meaning in whatever circumstances we face is a capacity that connects us across time and culture to all those who have come before and all those who will come after. Sleep well, then, with the knowledge that you are part of this long human story of survival and adaptation, of hunger satisfied and abundance shared, of simple meals that sustain complex lives. Dream, perhaps, of dark bread and thin ale, of the quiet rhythm of daily labor and the deep satisfaction of work completed and rest earned, and wake tomorrow to your own abundance with gratitude for all those who went before, whose struggles and skills and stubborn hope made possible the plenty that now surrounds us. The medieval world fades into the gentle darkness of sleep, but its lessons remain that every meal is a gift, that simple pleasures can be profound satisfactions, and that the human capacity to find nourishment and meaning in whatever life provides is one of our greatest and most enduring strengths. Rest now in that knowledge, and let the deep quiet of historical distance carry you gently into dreams where all hunger is satisfied and all thirst is quenched, where every simple meal becomes a feast, and every day survived is a victory worth celebrating. And so ends our quiet journey through the medieval world of hunger and abundance, of daily bread and nightly rest. Sleep well, fellow travelers through time, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle satisfaction of those who have tasted history and found it, despite all its hardships, somehow sweet.